Normandy, France, July 1944. The hedgerows were thick, the mud was deep, and the air was filled with the tension of a coiled spring. In a field just outside the village of Cerisy-la-Forêt, a German reconnaissance plane buzzed overhead, its engine whining through the broken cloud cover. The pilot looked down and froze. Below him in a clearing sat a formidable column of American M4 Sherman tanks, their turrets pointed menacingly toward the German lines. The pilot frantically radioed the coordinates back to the Wehrmacht command. Artillery calculations were made. Panic began to set in among the German ranks at the prospect of a heavy armored breakthrough. But down on the ground, the reality was far stranger. As soon as the plane disappeared into the clouds, an American soldier named Arthur, a skinny kid from New York, walked up to one of the 30-ton steel war machines. He didn't climb inside. He grabbed the underside of the fender and with a heave that should have shattered his spine, lifted the entire tank off the ground. He turned to his sergeant. "Sarge," he yelled, "the wind is picking up. If we don't stake these down, the whole armored division is going to blow away to Switzerland." This was not the 3rd Armored Division. This was not a collection of hardened tank veterans. This was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a top-secret unit of 1,100 men armed with 93-pound inflatable rubber tanks, 500-pound speakers, art supplies, and pure, unadulterated American audacity. They were known simply as the Ghost Army, and for 50 years, their existence was a secret that the U.S. government refused to admit, leaving their story untold, while the men who lived it carried the burden of silence to their graves. To understand how the U.S. Army ended up deploying painters, sculptors, and sound engineers to the front lines of the deadliest war in history, one must understand the desperation of 1944. General Dwight D. Eisenhower knew that the Allied invasion of Europe was a numbers game, but it was also a game of wits. The Germans were dug in, disciplined, and dangerous. To win, the Allies didn't just need more bullets, they needed to be where the Germans didn't expect them to be. The concept was born from a wild idea by American planners who had observed British deception tactics in North Africa. They decided to take the concept of the Trojan horse and industrialize it. They wouldn't just build a few decoys, they would build a traveling roadshow of war. The Army recruited from the unlikeliest of places: the Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, the Art Student League of New York, and fashion houses in Paris and Manhattan. Enter the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, the visual arm of the Ghost Army. These weren't your typical G.I. Joes. These were artists. They were creative, slightly rebellious, and they sketched everything they saw. Among them was Bill Blass, who would go on to become a fashion icon, and Ellsworth Kelly, a future giant of modern art. But in 1943, at Camp Forest, Tennessee, they were just kids trying to figure out how to inflate a rubber Jeep without it looking like a sagging balloon. The training was bizarre. While other units were learning bayonet drills and hand-to-hand combat, the men of the 23rd were learning how to simulate the atmosphere of a 30,000-man army with only 1,100 men. The unit was built on 4 distinct pillars of deception, each a masterclass in psychological warfare. First was the visual deception. They utilized inflatable M4 tanks, cargo trucks, jeeps, and even artillery pieces made of neoprene rubber. From 500 yards away, they were indistinguishable from the real thing, but up close, they were fragile balloons. Next came the sonic deception, the 31st 32nd Signal Service Company. Led by the enigmatic Colonel Hilton Rayleigh, they recorded the specific sounds of armored columns, bridge building, and swearing sergeants on primitive wire recorders at Fort Knox. They mounted massive 500-pound speakers on half-tracks that could project sound up to 15 miles away. They could literally play a mixtape of a tank division attacking from the left, while the real tanks flanked from the right. Then came the radio deception. The Signal Company Special tapped out fake radio messages, mimicking the specific Morse code fists, the unique tapping styles of real operators from real divisions. They created ghost networks, filling the airwaves with chatter about moving supplies and angry commanders, knowing the Germans were listening. Finally, the combat engineers of the 406th Company provided the physical evidence. They drove bulldozers and trucks to make tracks in the mud, ensuring that if a German plane flew over the inflatable tanks, they would see fresh tire tracks leading up to them. A tank without tracks was a dead giveaway. By May 1944, the traveling circus was ready. They packed their sketchbooks and their sewing kits and shipped out to England. But the fun and games of training ended abruptly when they hit the continent. In September 1944, the honeymoon of the Normandy breakout was over. General George S. Patton's Third Army was moving fast, too fast. There was a dangerous 70-mile gap in the American line near the city of Metz. If the Germans realized how weak that section was, they could punch through and sever Patton's supply lines. Patton didn't have the men to fill the gap. He needed a miracle. He called for the Ghosts. The unit arrived in the dead of night at the Bettemberg Gap. Their mission was suicide on paper: protect a massive stretch of the front line for 7 days against the 11th Panzer Division. Hardened veterans with real Panther tanks and heavy artillery. If the Germans attacked, the Ghost Army would be slaughtered. A rubber tank cannot stop an 88mm shell. The 1,100 men were pretending to be the 6th Armored Division, a force of 8,000 men. As dusk fell, the artists went to work. "Get those compressors running, but muffle the sound," ordered Captain Fred Fox. Under the cover of darkness, the flat rubber skins were rolled out. Slowly, the silhouette of a formidable armored force rose from the grass. They placed the decoys imperfectly, intentionally. "Don't hide them too well," Fox instructed. "We want the Jerrys to see them, but just barely." Camouflage nets were draped loosely. Then came the sonic trucks. The massive speakers turned toward the German lines and began to blast Program 4, heavy tank column movement. The sound was visceral, the screech of metal treads, the roar of engines, the shouting of commands. To the German listening posts across the valley, it sounded exactly like a fresh American armored division moving into position. But the deception went deeper. The Ghost Army developed a technique called special effects. Soldiers would go into local French towns near the front line, sewing fake patches onto their uniforms, the patches of the 6th Armored Division. They went to cafes, ordered omelets, and talked loudly about the colonel and how the tanks need refueling. They knew German spies were everywhere. One Ghost Army soldier, masquerading as a major general, drove around in a jeep with official markings. He would stop at crossroads, look at maps, point aggressively toward the German lines, and then speed off. The message was clear. The brass is here. The attack is imminent. For 7 days, the 11th Panzer Division hesitated. They could hear the tanks. They saw the reconnaissance photos. They intercepted the radio traffic. They were convinced a massive American force was sitting right in front of them. Instead of attacking the weak spot, the Germans dug in. By the time the real 6th Armored Division actually arrived to relieve the Ghost Army, the 23rd had packed up their balloons and vanished. They had held the line with nothing but hot air and courage. The war dragged on into 1945, and the stakes grew higher. The Allies were at the border of Germany, facing the final barrier, the Rhine River. Crossing it would be the death blow to the Third Reich. The Germans had massed their remaining strength along the riverbanks. The U.S. 9th Army needed to cross near the industrial city of Wesel, but to do so without a massacre, they needed the Germans to look the other way. This led to Operation Viersen, the Ghost Army's masterpiece. The plan was audacious. The Ghost Army would simulate 2 entire infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th, preparing to cross the river at a location 10 miles south of the actual crossing point. The scale was massive. The 23rd deployed over 600 inflatable tanks and artillery pieces. They built a fake war infrastructure, including a fake headquarters, fake supply dumps, and a fake airfield using decoy observation planes. The sonic teams played the sounds of pontoon bridges being constructed.
The rhythmic clank, clank, clank of hammers hitting steel echoed across the Rhine all night long. The Germans, terrified of a crossing, poured artillery fire into the sound. The Ghost Army soldiers sat in their foxholes, shivering as real shells exploded around their rubber tanks. This was the most dangerous part of the job, drawing fire. Every shell that hit a decoy was a shell that didn't hit a real American soldier. One night, a German shell landed directly on an inflatable truck. It didn't explode in a fireball. It just deflated with a sad whoosh. The soldiers nearby burst out laughing, a brief release of tension in the midst of hell.
On March 23, 1945, the deception reached its climax. The German command was fully convinced the attack was coming from the Viersen sector. They shifted their reserves to meet the imaginary threat. Then, 10 miles north, the real Ninth Army launched its attack. The roar was deafening as thousands of real troops and tanks hit the water. They met significantly lighter resistance than expected. The Germans had been looking the wrong way. General Simpson later estimated that the Ghost Army had saved roughly 10,000 to 30,000 American lives in that single week. When the war ended in May 1945, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had participated in over 20 battlefield deceptions. 3 of their men had been killed, dozens wounded. But there were no parades for them. They were ordered to keep their mouths shut. The Pentagon classified the existence of the Ghost Army as top secret. The logic was cold but sound. The U.S. Army might need to use these tricks again against the Soviets in the coming Cold War. If the world knew about the sonic trucks and the inflatables, the tactics would be useless. So the artists went home. Bill Blass went to New York in revolutionized fashion. Ellsworth Kelly went to Paris. They married, had children, and grew old. When their families asked, "What did you do in the war?" they had to lie. "I blew up bridges," one would say. "I was in the infantry," said another. They carried the secret for 50 years. It wasn't until 1996 that the government finally declassified the mission. Suddenly, elderly men in their 70s and 80s could finally tell their families the truth. "I didn't blow up tanks, I blew up balloons." The story of the Ghost Army is more than just a quirky footnote of World War II. It is a testament to American ingenuity. In a war defined by industrial might and atomic power, a small group of artists proved that imagination could be just as lethal as a bullet. They painted on the canvas of Europe. Their medium was mud, sound, and rubber. Their audience was the German army, and their masterpiece was saving the lives of tens of thousands of their fellow countrymen who never even knew they were there. In 2024, the unit was finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, ensuring that while they were ghosts in 1944, they would be remembered as heroes forever.